Hey, 42 here. On the 13th of May 1662, a Portuguese princess stepped ashore in Portsmouth Harbour, ready to take her place as Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland. Parched from her journey, she politely asked for a cup of tea. A reasonable request, really. Except nobody knew what the hell she was talking about. Strange as it may sound today, this was Britain in the days before tea had become a national obsession. The princess's name was Catherine of Braganza, and she'd recently been promised in marriage to King Charles II. Just like any bride preparing for her big day, Catherine brought a few ships worth of luxury gear with her, including a chest full of tea, her favourite drink. Soon enough, drinking tea was popular with the rest of the royal family, then amongst the aristocracy, then the wealthy elite. But whilst tea may have started out as an exclusive indulgence of the 1%, these days it's pretty much a basic human right. Every day my fellow citizens and I consume 100 million cups of the stuff. That's about 9 billion litres of tea a year. If you were to build a canal 1 metre wide and about a metre deep, and fill it with Britain's annual tea consumption, it would stretch from London to Hong Kong. Anyone visiting Birmingham may assume we've already built such a tea-filled canal, but don't be fooled, it's just shit. In other words, we Brits are tea addicts, the third biggest tea drinkers per capita in the world after Turkey and Ireland. But Britain's journey from tea virgin to virtuoso is a surprisingly controversial one. Because when Catherine of Braganza started a craze for tea amongst a who's who of high society in Blighty, she unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that would shift the world economy, trigger 2 wars, and see millions of people get addicted to opium. And in the middle of it all was an unlikely disruptor, a British scientist who went undercover and changed the world through, and I'm not making this up, botanical espionage. So if you're fond of tea bagging and like a good spy story, you might want to put the kettle on, because this is a good one. Legend has it that the word tea comes from the words transporta de ervas aromáticas, meaning transport of aromatic herbs, which was carved on Catherine of Braganza's tea crates. But sadly, that's just not true. The name is actually a corruption of one of the Chinese words for tea, and it came to Europe by way of the Dutch, who were amongst the first Westerners to trade with the Chinese. By the time Princess Catherine landed on British mud, the Dutch owned the lucrative European trade in tea, but that monopoly would soon end. As local demand for the drink surged, the English and later British East India Company saw an opportunity to make a few bob, and sent trade envoys to Canton, present-day Guangzhou, just a teabag's throw from Hong Kong. Without the benefit of a tea-filled canal, the trip from London to Canton was a perilous ship voyage that could take 4 months or more. And since it would still be at least a century before anyone figured out how to prevent scurvy and dysentery, taking that voyage meant there was a pretty good chance your teeth would fall out as you slowly shat yourself to death. On average, a staggering 30% of company employees died every year. But it did pay well. The East India Company put in its first tea order in 1664, just 2 years after Catherine of Braganza arrived in Britain. At the time, China was the only place in the world you could buy tea. And they'd been trying really hard to keep it that way, with all foreign trade out of the whole of China being restricted to a single port, Canton. Not only did that allow the Chinese to tightly control the flow of goods from east to west, it also meant they could set outrageous prices for scarce commodities like tea. So, tea was expensive to buy and dangerous to ship. It's no surprise that only the rich could afford it. A single pound of the stuff cost an entire year's salary for your average British worker. But the British East India Company knew that if only they could find some way to increase the supply, the demand would take care of itself. Now, there are few companies throughout history that could influence the trade policies of an entire nation. But the English East India Company did exactly that. To be honest, calling it a company is like calling Liam Neeson an exotic belly dancer. For one thing, it had its own army, consisting of over 250,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army at the time. The East India Company was effectively a semi-autonomous proxy power of the English government. And despite being labelled as a company, it conquered and ruled over huge swathes of Southeast Asia. How does a company colonise a country, you may ask? Mostly through bribery, corruption and military intimidation, and then leaving a company administrator behind to control said territory. Today, that would be like IKEA invading England and making Gustav from accounts Lord Commander of Blackpool. The past was mental, wasn't it? A large part of the company's financial success was thanks to this type of good old-fashioned land grabbing, but the really big boom in business was founded on tea. Oh, and drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. When William Pitt the Younger became Prime Minister of Britain in 1783, he cut the tax on tea from 119% to 12.5%. Almost overnight, it became affordable for people like me, my nan, and every builder from Plymouth to Preston to drink buckets of tea on a daily basis. Demand went through the roof, and trade with China exploded. Still the world's only tea exporter at the time, China quickly cemented its position as a global economic powerhouse. By the early 19th century, Britain alone was buying 32 million kilograms of Chinese tea every year. The problem was, China wanted payment in silver, which was hard for Britain to come by. So, the clever clogs at the East India Company came up with a cunning plan. A plan so cunning you could put a tail on it and call it a weasel. It was also illegal and led to millions of deaths. But hey, it wasn't personal, it was just business, so it was all completely bloody fine. By the late 1600s, the East India Company was growing large quantities of opium in India. At the time, opium was popular for pain relief, but for the Brits it was especially useful in relieving the headache of Chinese trade restrictions. The British began smuggling opium into China, where it was sold on the black market for silver. Silver, which was then used to buy more tea. The effect of this dastardly plan was catastrophic. Millions of Chinese citizens were soon wasting away in opium dens, which in turn took them out of the workforce. And with so much silver flowing out of the economy, local prices skyrocketed, pushing up taxes, which had to be paid in silver. The result was a failing economy and an angry, drug-addled populace. Over the course of a whole century, from 1729 to 1831, multiple Chinese emperors tried to stem the flow of opium into their country through a series of bans. But seeing as it was being sold on the black market in the first place, that was never going to help. By 1839, some 40,000 chests of opium were being illegally smuggled into China every year, generating enough silver to fund the entire tea trade. The Chinese got so desperate they wrote an open letter asking Queen Victoria herself to put an end to the situation. But when even that didn't help, they went nuclear. In a series of raids, they seized and eventually destroyed all the opium stored in the warehouses of Canton Port. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of some seriously good shit. Not my words, the words of half the Chinese population in 1839. Probably. The British, apparently, didn't take too kindly to having countless tons of illegal drugs taken off them, because they responded by sending a flotilla of warships. The First Opium War had begun. If China and Britain going to war would be horribly one-sided today, things weren't much different in the mid-19th century, only back then it was the other way around. The British Empire was near its peak, and British naval power in particular was unmatched. Things went very badly for the Chinese, and by 1842, bloodied and beaten, they were forced to sign the absolutely brutal Treaty of Nanking. This was a complex legal document, but its contents can be summed up as something along the lines of, "Sorry for all the trouble, please traffic as many drugs as you like into our country, and please also accept $21 million in reparations for burning the narcotics you illegally smuggled. Oh, and here's Hong Kong, we don't want it anyway." Things went swimmingly for a while, if you were British, Until 1853, when, rather inconveniently, China's new imperial commissioner took it upon himself to end the opium trade once and for all. Given that it was still technically illegal and crippling his entire country, I suppose he may have had a point, but the Brits didn't agree. After a British ship was seized and its crew imprisoned, all hell broke loose in the form of the Second Opium War. By 1858, the fighting was over and China was once again signing cripplingly apologetic treaties, this time with Britain and France. The terms of these new agreements were even more brutal than the first ones. China would pay damages for the war, legalize the opium trade, make 10 additional ports available to trade in, and let foreign traders and missionaries travel wherever they wanted within the country. Between them, the two opium wars had devastated the Chinese economy, realigned the global balance of power, and started what the Chinese would later call the Century of Humiliation, which coincidentally is the title of Prince Harry's next book. Still, at least they had tea, right? Actually, wrong. Because as the First Opium War was drawing to a close, the East India Company was putting a plan in action to make sure China's monopoly on tea production would be broken forever. Enter Robert Fortune, a humble Scottish botanist with a penchant for fancy dress. Fortune was originally hired in 1842 to spend 3 years travelling around China collecting plants. Not a bad gig for a plant geek. As you've probably guessed though, the East India Company didn't really give a shit about flowers and shrubs. They were after one bush and one bush only. Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. The world of tea growing was off limits to foreigners. So, in 1848, the company offered Fortune a small, fortune, to travel back to China to uncover the secrets of tea production and, if possible, return with tea plants and seeds. This time, Fortune went incognito, dressed as a Chinese merchant with a traditional haircut and a fake braid of hair attached to the back of his head. I'm guessing he did a funny accent too, but I won't do a reenactment of that now because I don't fancy getting demonetized today. Now, apparently being cancelled hadn't been invented in the 19th century, so the new Chinese version of Mr. Fortune was able to travel deeper into China than any foreigner before him. He learned the secrets of growing and manufacturing tea, and was the first Westerner to find out that black tea and green tea come from the same plant. Most of all though, he managed to get his hands on the plants themselves. On his first attempt, the botanist managed to smuggle 13,000 tea plants and 10,000 seeds out of China. But most of them died on the way to India, where the East India Company was ready to start its plantations. But using a newly invented device called a Wardian case, essentially a portable terrarium, he tried again. This time managing to transport seeds and plants successfully to their new home in Darjeeling, India. If you happen to be a tea lover, of course you're a tea lover. You aren't a savage now, are you? That name is no doubt familiar. Darjeeling is where the British tea industry took root, literally. By the late 19th century, political controversy over the East India Company's admittedly pretty outrageous practices overseas had reached fever pitch, and the business was dissolved in 1874. But for China, the damage was already done. Other nations like the Dutch and Americans had followed the British strategy of creating their own tea lands, and within a few decades, China's hold on the world's tea industry was shattered. At the height of its trade in the 1880s, China was exporting 134,000 tons of tea a year. By 1949, it was fewer than 10. The Opium Wars had crippled the Chinese economy, and losing control of the world's tea trade ensured it wouldn't recover for generations, laying the foundations for a world controlled by the West. So, next time you put the kettle on, think about the role your humble cuppa has played in global history. And for heaven's sake man, use a coaster. Thanks for watching.